What if the most iconic retail brand in Canada's entire history, a company older than Canada itself, didn't have to die? What if the 355-year legacy of Hudson's Bay wasn't killed by Amazon, or inflation, or even a pandemic, but by something far more avoidable? What if the people who were supposed to save it were actually, according to some analysts, the ones who finished it off? Because here's what the headlines didn't tell you. When Hudson's Bay filed for creditor protection under the CCAA on March 7, 2025, the company reportedly had somewhere between $3 million and $3.3 million in cash on hand, according to court documents filed at the time. To put that into perspective, that is a staggeringly small amount of liquidity for a national retailer with dozens of locations still open across the country. And yet, just 2 years before that filing, the chairman of the company was reportedly quoted in major Canadian media saying Hudson's Bay was at, quote, the greatest value and financial strength it's ever been since 1670. Think about that for a second. 1670, the year the company was founded. So what actually happened? In this video, we're going to walk through the full story. The rise, the quiet unraveling, and the deeply uncomfortable truth about how a 355-year-old Canadian institution was, according to industry observers and retail analysts, effectively stripped for parts. And by the time we get to the final chapter, you're going to understand why this story isn't just about a department store. It's a warning about what happens when a beloved Canadian brand falls into the wrong hands. Stay with us, because this one gets dark. To understand how far Hudson's Bay fell, you have to first understand what it was. Founded in 1670, more than 200 years before Canada even became a country, the Hudson's Bay Company began as a fur trading operation backed by England's King Charles II. Two French explorers, Pierre-Esprit Radisson and Médard Chouart de Groseilliers, convinced the British Crown to charter the company and grant it trading rights over an enormous stretch of northern territory known as Rupert's Land. That territory, by various historical estimates, covered a significant portion of what is now modern Canada. Some estimates put it as high as 40%, though figures vary depending on the source. So before there was a Canada, there was Hudson's Bay. By the late 1800s, as the fur trade declined, the company pivoted into retail, and it did it well. A flagship store opened in Winnipeg in 1881. Grand multi-story department stores followed in cities from Vancouver to Halifax. The Bay, as Canadians came to call it, became the place you went for everything. Clothes, housewares, appliances, furniture. Multiple generations of Canadian families have memories tied to those stores. By the early 2000s, according to reports from that era, HBC's combined brands were among the largest retail operations in Canada by sales, employing tens of thousands of people across the country. The company operated the Bay and Zellers and had connections to the broader Sears Canada retail ecosystem through historical corporate relationships. It was, by every measure, a retail giant. And then it was sold. In 2008, a New York-based private equity firm called NRDC Equity Partners, specialists in real estate, not retail, acquired the Hudson's Bay Company for a reported price in the range of $1.1 billion. The deal was led by a man named Richard Baker, who became the company's chairman and governor. Now, private equity buying legacy retail isn't unusual. What's worth noting is what their stated expertise was going in. NRDC's background, according to reports, was primarily in real estate development. Baker's family had built their wealth through commercial real estate. His father ran a strip mall development company. And according to analysts who've since reviewed HBC's trajectory under private equity ownership, that lens, seeing real estate first and retail second, may have shaped nearly every major decision that followed. The first major move, selling the Zellers' leasehold interests, up to 220 locations, to American retailer Target in a deal reported at approximately 1.825 billion Canadian dollars. On the surface, it looked like a smart exit from a struggling discount brand. What it actually meant was that HBC had just handed a potential competitor access to hundreds of Canadian locations and walked away from their entire budget retail customer base right at the moment Walmart was aggressively expanding across Canada. Target's Canadian entry, as many Canadians remember, was a disaster, but that disaster benefited Target's landlords and creditors more than it hurt NRDC. HBC had already cashed the check. Rather than stabilizing and investing in the core Hudson's Bay brand, fixing up stores, modernizing inventory, competing for younger shoppers, what followed, according to reports, was a series of increasingly aggressive acquisitions funded largely by debt. In 2013, HBC acquired Saks Incorporated, the owner of Saks Fifth Avenue, in a deal widely reported at the time as approximately $2.9 billion US, financed primarily through senior secured loans. In 2015, the company acquired Germany's Galeria Kaufhof. In 2016, they expanded Hudson's Bay into the Netherlands. These moves, executed in rapid succession, loaded the company with debt at a pace that alarmed many retail observers at the time, and the financial results reflected that. According to reporting from that period, the company's losses ran into the hundreds of millions annually for multiple consecutive years, with some years reportedly posting net losses in the range of $500 million or more, even against revenues that looked impressive on paper. The European expansion, according to industry analysts, was described as a costly miscalculation. All Dutch locations were shuttered by 2019. The German department store assets were sold off. Other acquisitions and investments made along the way were offloaded for undisclosed or reportedly unfavorable amounts. Meanwhile, the actual Hudson's Bay stores in Canada, the ones that millions of everyday Canadians actually shopped in, were receiving, according to observers, minimal reinvestment. By the time 2022 rolled around, cracks in the foundation were impossible to ignore. Foot traffic was declining, sales were softening, and rather than announcing a serious reinvestment plan for the core-based stores, what management apparently decided to do instead was reach back into the nostalgia playbook. In late 2022, Hudson's Bay announced it would revive Zellers, the beloved discount chain that had been sold off to Target nearly a decade earlier. The announcement generated enormous excitement among Canadians. Zellers, at its peak in the late 1990s, had operated hundreds of locations nationwide. It held a genuinely special place in Canadian retail culture, with its famous slogan, "Where the lowest price is the law," practically burned into the memory of anyone who grew up shopping there. But what Canadians got back was not that Zellers. According to reports, the revived brand launched as a small store-within-a-store concept tucked inside existing Hudson's Bay locations. There was reportedly no dedicated Zellers staff in most locations, no return of the beloved in-store restaurant, and critically, according to retail analysts, no compelling value proposition to differentiate it from Dollarama, Walmart, or any other existing discount competitor. A market research survey conducted by polling firm Lidger, as reported by Retail Insider, found that while 56% of Canadians were aware of the new Zellers concept inside Hudson's Bay locations, only 9% had actually shopped or browsed in one. That's not a brand revival. That's a marketing exercise. Retail analyst Bruce Winder, quoted in reports at the time, reportedly described the Zellers spaces as feeling like an afterthought, simply occupying unused square footage inside stores that were already struggling with foot traffic. According to one visual merchandising expert cited in a Retail Insider report, the sections looked, in their words, like a clearance section, not a serious retail initiative. What made this especially telling was what the Zellers revival revealed about Hudson's Bay's overall strategy at that moment. According to a leaked internal memo reviewed and reported on by Retail Insider, HBC's total sales reportedly collapsed by nearly a third in fiscal 2024, dropping to roughly $1.11 billion from approximately $1.65 billion the year before. E-commerce sales reportedly fell by close to 50% from around $300 million down to $142 million. According to the same reporting, advertising support for Zellers was reportedly cut back, and what little initial attention the concept had generated quietly faded by 2024. In other words, Zellers wasn't a turnaround strategy. According to observers, it was a distraction, one that consumed management attention and marketing resources at the exact moment the core business needed emergency intervention. Here's the thing that no financial report captures, but that any Canadian who actually walked into a Hudson's Bay store in the last decade would immediately recognize. The stores were, by most accounts, quietly falling apart. Shoppers and retail observers widely reported conditions consistent with years of underinvestment: stained carpets, idle escalators, dated interiors, peeling paint on exteriors, and discolored ceiling panels. Product selections, according to shoppers, felt dated and disconnected from what consumers, particularly younger ones, were actually looking for. Price points, meanwhile, were difficult to justify when competing retailers were offering comparable quality for less. And according to a Retail Insider report citing a leaked internal memo from early 2025, the digital side of the business had been collapsing just as visibly. Customers reportedly described online orders that never arrived, customer service that was inconsistent or non-existent, and delivery timelines that were routinely missed. Multiple vendors, according to the same reporting, had been promised payment on outstanding invoices mere weeks before the creditor protection filing, promises that reportedly went unfulfilled. One apparel vendor quoted in that report said simply, "They left a lot of people hanging." The picture that emerges from all of this, the deteriorating stores, the failed Zellers concept, the collapsing e-commerce experience, is not one of a company fighting for survival. According to analysts and industry observers, it's the picture of a company that had already, in practical terms, stopped trying. Industry analysts have pointed out the stark contrast between Hudson's Bay and retailers that were actually thriving in the Canadian market. Quebec-based Simons, for instance, had been expanding nationally with modern store design, curated fashion, and loyal younger customers. Japanese retailer Uniqlo had carved out a profitable niche with a clear identity and competitive pricing. The difference, analysts noted, wasn't the department store format itself. Canadian consumers still shop at department stores. The difference was investment, vision, and relevance. Hudson's Bay had none of those three things in meaningful supply. Here's where the story takes a turn that, quite frankly, is difficult to process. In March of 2023, 2 years before the company filed for creditor protection, Chairman Richard Baker reportedly gave an interview to the Globe and Mail. According to accounts of that interview widely cited in Canadian business media, Baker was quoted as saying Hudson's Bay was at the greatest value and financial strength it's ever been since 1670. He was also reportedly quoted saying he planned to remain governor of the company until, in his words, the day they put me in the ground. 2 years later, according to court documents filed at the time, Hudson's Bay had between $3 million and $3.3 million in cash on hand, more than $2 billion in combined debt and lease-related obligations, and was seeking creditor protection under Canada's Companies Creditors Arrangement Act. According to court documents reviewed by reporters in the 12 months leading up to January 31st, 2025, the company had reportedly lost $329.7 million. And there's one more detail from those court documents worth sitting with. According to reporting at the time, the final trigger for the creditor protection filing wasn't just years of accumulated losses. It was in part the US-Canada trade war and the tariff uncertainty that emerged in early 2025. According to court filings reviewed by reporters, lenders who had been in discussions with HBC about refinancing walked away when the economic environment deteriorated, leaving the company with no runway and no options. Hudson's Bay was, by that point, so financially fragile that a broader macroeconomic shock, the kind of thing that stronger, better capitalized retailers absorb and move past, was enough to end it entirely. That's not bad luck. According to analysts, that's the direct result of more than a decade of debt loading, underinvestment, and, as some observers have argued, an ownership model that was never really designed to build a lasting retail business in the first place. Make of that what you will. The creditor protection filing came on March 7, 2025. Within weeks, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice approved the liquidation of the vast majority of the company's locations, initially sparing just 6 stores, mostly in Toronto and Montreal, while allowing additional time to explore restructuring options. By late April, that hope was gone. According to reports, the court determined a viable bid for those remaining stores was unlikely, and liquidation of all locations was authorized. By June 2025, according to reports, the liquidation process had run its course. Over 8,300 retail employees lost their jobs. Nearly 1,000 more in offices and logistics centers were expected to follow. In total, according to reports, the collapse affected more than 9,300 Canadians who had worked for the company, some with over 3 decades of service. But here's the part of this story that, according to many observers, crossed a line that even the financial wreckage hadn't crossed yet. While those 9,300 workers were losing their jobs, with no severance, the company confirmed it would be paying up to $3 million in retention bonuses to 121 managers and executives overseeing the liquidation. That total was confirmed to CBC News by a Hudson's Bay spokesperson. To put that in plain terms, a company with roughly $3 million in cash, barely enough to cover a week of operations, was routing funds toward executive bonuses while frontline employees, some of whom had given the company decades of their working lives, were told they would receive nothing beyond what Canada's limited wage earner protection program might eventually provide. Under Canadian law, cash-strapped companies filing for creditor protection can legally opt out of paying severance, forcing laid-off workers to line up as unsecured creditors. a category that, in most bankruptcy proceedings, results in pennies on the dollar, if anything at all. The reaction from Canadian labor groups was immediate and sharp. According to reports, Canadian Labour Congress President B. Brusk described the situation as incredibly egregious. Unifor National President Lana Payne was quoted in reports as calling it corporate greed at its worst. One affected distribution worker, quoted by CBC News, described waking up in the middle of the night with worry and said that many coworkers were afraid to speak publicly because of non-disclosure agreements they had signed when they were hired. What made this especially painful for many Canadians was how familiar it felt. In 2017, Sears Canada went through an almost identical situation. 12,000 workers lost their jobs with no severance, while the company simultaneously paid large retention bonuses to executives and senior managers. The outrage from that collapse contributed to federal legislation passed in 2023 improving pension protections for workers when employers become insolvent. But critically, according to reports, those new protections are not fully in effect until 2027. And importantly, the legislation addresses pension protections, not severance pay. So when Hudson's Bay collapsed in 2025, the same script played out almost word for word. Canada had already watched this happen once, and the legal framework, according to labor advocates, still wasn't built to stop it from happening again. And the brand itself, according to reports, Canadian Tire acquired the intellectual property portfolio, the Hudson's Bay name, trademarks, the iconic striped blankets, the coat of arms, for $30 million. By October 2025, Canadian Tire had reportedly begun selling Hudson's Bay Point blankets in their stores. A 355-year-old brand sold for $30 million to Canadian Tire. By the end of 2025, according to reports, the liquidation was essentially complete. Store leases had been sold off or returned to landlords. Artifacts and remaining assets had been auctioned. The corporate entity that had once been North America's oldest company was, in practical terms, no longer a going concern. North America's oldest company in its final chapter was just a memory. So what does this all mean for you as a Canadian consumer? First, it means the brands you love are not permanent. Hudson's Bay survived fur trade collapses, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and 3.5 centuries of economic upheaval. What it didn't survive was a decade of private equity ownership, chronic underinvestment, and leadership that, according to multiple analysts, prioritized financial engineering over actual retail. Second, it's a reminder to pay attention when the people in charge are saying everything is fine while the physical evidence in front of you says otherwise. Deteriorating stores, idle escalators, empty aisles, those aren't cosmetic issues, those are signals. And third, there are still great Canadian retailers fighting to earn your business. Simons, MEC, local independent retailers who reinvest in their communities. When you choose where to spend your money, that choice matters more than most people think. Hudson's Bay is gone, but the lesson it leaves behind is permanent. When a company stops serving its customers and starts serving its investors, the customers always find out eventually, usually when the liquidation signs go up. If this video opened your eyes, share it with someone who remembers shopping at the Bay. And if you want more consumer investigations like this, stay with us at North America Crisis Radar. We'll keep doing the digging so you don't have to.